This video is on Unit 3.2, the cell membrane. So before we get into the cell membrane, which is also known as the plasma membrane, there are two definitions we need to look over. The first is hydrophobic, the second being hydrophilic. So in order to figure out what these words mean, let's look at those prefixes. Hydro, hopefully you know, means water. So in both cases we have water involved in these definitions. And hopefully you've seen the word phobic around somewhere before, like a phobia of something. So if you have claustrophobia, you're afraid of being in small spaces. Phobic is just fearing. So if you have a phobia of something, you're afraid of it. So hydrophobic is water fearing. Hydrophilic is water loving. Now what are we talking about being water fearing or water loving here is not people. These are molecules that either bind with water or do not bind with water. In fact, they often repel water. So a hydrophobic molecule will be a molecule that repels water because it fears water. It does not like water. A hydrophilic molecule would be a molecule that binds with water. And again, because it's a water-loving molecule. All right? So now that we have those definitions under our belt, let's move on to what this has to do with the plasma membrane or the cell membrane. Remember, all living cells are a periodic cell, and they're all made of a molecule called a phospholipid. Now, you studied lipids back when we did the marshmallow molecules. Lipids are also known as fats. So this is a special kind of fat. It's called a phospholipid because this fat has phosphorus in it. The phosphorus is at what's considered the head end of the molecule, and then it has these two tails that are the fatty acid chains. Remember we did the marshmallow molecules, you showed fatty acids as being a chain of carbons with many hydrogens attached to them in the form of toothpicks? Well, that's what each of these chains are. They're fatty acid chains of carbons and hydrogens, and they have a phosphate at the top which has phosphorus in it. A simpler way to show this is the head, or the phosphorus section, just as a round ball, and then the two fatty acid chains separately there. Well, it just so happens that that phosphorus at the top of the phospholipid up here is hydrophilic. Remember, that's water loving. So it can bind to water. Whereas the fatty acid chains, the carbon and the hydrogens, are hydrophobic. So they repel water. So if the cell membrane is made out of these phospholipids, there's a portion of the cell membrane that binds water, and there's a portion of the cell membrane that repels water, and that's going to be really important later when we discuss the function of the cell membrane as a whole. When we look at the cell membrane, we call it a fluid mosaic model, and I'll get into that and why that is in just a moment. So to answer that question, we need to look at the entire structure. So first of all, these little purple and yellow things. So one of these little purple balls is like that phosphate head of the phospholipid, and then all of these little yellow guys are the little tails of the phospholipids, so those fatty acid tails. And you'll notice we don't just have one layer here of fatty acids, we have another layer that's upside down right here of fatty acids. So here's all the heads stacked right next to each other, and here's the tails. So if you're drawing yourself a picture of this for your notes, you can draw one row facing this way with all their tails inside, and then another row facing this way with all their tails inside. And that's what the lipid membrane looks like. So all around the border of the cell is this layer of lipids that are considered a bilayer. Bi meaning two. So the cell membrane is actually a lipid bilayer. Now, there aren't just lipids in our lipid bilayer, however. There are some other things as well. One of the things that we have in the lipid bilayer are these brown things called the protein channels. So if you look at this first one way over here, this protein channel, okay, it goes all the way through the cell membrane from one side to the other. So things come into the cell from the outside, go through the channel just like a straw, and can get into the inside of the cell to do what they're supposed to do. Or things could go out of the cell through the protein channel and leave the cell to go where they're supposed to go. So a channel is like a straw or a hole, a tunnel through the cell membrane. There are also some other proteins that are stuck into the membrane. You can see not all of them go all the way through. And those other proteins could be a protein pump. They also move things in and out of the cell membrane, but they force them or pump them in one direction or another. We'll talk more about those as our cells unit goes on. And then finally, there are some carbohydrates that are involved in the cell membrane. Those are those little green tree things sticking on the outside of the cell membrane. Those are what we call the carbohydrate markers. They identify the cell. So it tells your body this is a blood cell or this is a muscle cell. And it also tells your body that they belong to you, that they are your cells. Bacterial cells have different carbohydrate markers on them so that the body can recognize that's a foreign cell or a bad cell from outside your body. So the carbohydrate markers are kind of like an ID tag that tells what kind of cell it is and also if it belongs to you or something else. So again, we have this fluid mosaic model that's made up of lots of different parts. That's where the mosaic part of this model comes from. So that word mosaic means many parts. If you're an art person and you've heard of an art mosaic before, an art mosaic is a big picture that's made of a lot of smaller little tiny pieces or tiles or colors to make it together. And secondly, the model is fluid because all of these pieces don't just stay in one place. The protein channels and the protein pumps and the carbohydrate markers and the phospholipids can kind of bob around like apples in water when you go bobbing for apples at Halloween, and those apples can kind of move around and shift around in the water. These little parts of the cell membrane do the same thing. So it is a fluid membrane. All of these different parts of the membrane can change positions relative to each other. Okay, with all of those parts in mind, now we're going to look at what that means for what the cell membrane does. So first, let's see what can actually move through those lipids. So what kinds of molecules can wiggle between the lipids themselves? So they have to be pretty small, number one. So small molecules are things like little gases, like oxygen, and sometimes water can also go through as well. Finally, they have to be uncharged substances. By a charged substance, we mean something like an ion that we talked about in the chemistry review, like sodium ion, for example, has a positive charge, and chlorine ion has a negative charge. So things that are uncharged, or things that are neutral, and again, remember, they have to be small, can wiggle through those little lipids of the bilayer. The second column shows things that can't move through the lipids. So they have to get through the cell membrane some other way. So we can't get large molecules through the cell membrane through the lipids. So things like glucose. Glucose is a pretty big molecule. Things like starch. They need another option for getting through the cell membrane. Charged substances, I just talked about some examples of those. For example, the sodium ion and the chloride ion. They have a charge, a positive or negative charge, so they have to get through the cell membrane another way. They cannot wiggle through the phospholipids. So when you put those all together, what does this mean? Things like ions, proteins, carbohydrates, and of course the organelles, we don't want them getting out of the cell membrane. They're all too big or they're charged and they cannot go in and out of those phospholipids.